I walked into the bank that morning to withdraw $500. That's all. $500 to fix a transmission that had been grinding for 2 weeks straight. The teller looked at her screen. Her fingers stopped moving. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't place somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "Ma'am," she said, her voice suddenly careful, measured, "could you please have a seat? Our branch manager needs to speak with you. Immediately." I remember my stomach dropping. I thought someone had cloned my card. I thought I was about to spend the next 3 hours on the phone with fraud protection explaining charges I never made. I had no idea. None. That the next 20 minutes would unmake everything I thought I understood about my own life. My name is Kayla Bennetson. I'm 42 years old, a major in the United States Army, and until that Tuesday morning in March, I would have told you my life was simple, uncomplicated, not easy. 20 years of service doesn't leave you unscarred, but simple in the way that mattered. I knew who I was, I knew what I had, and what I had wasn't much. I drive a 2009 Civic with 230,000 miles on it. The transmission had been slipping for weeks, that telltale shudder every time I shifted into third, and I'd finally scraped together enough to get it looked at. $500. That was the number the mechanic quoted me, and that was the number I'd come to withdraw. I live in a one-bedroom off-base rental with second-hand furniture I've hauled from posting to posting for 2 decades. I'm not complaining. It's the life I chose, or maybe the life that chose me back when I was 18, and desperate to get as far away from my family as the Army could send me. I should tell you about my father because he matters to this story more than anything else does. My dad died when I was 17. Cancer fast and merciless, the kind that takes a strong man and turns him into someone you barely recognize in a matter of months. I remember sitting in the hospital hallway, my school backpack still on my shoulders, because nobody had thought to tell me to take it off, listening to the machines through a half-open door. After the funeral, my mother sat me down at our kitchen table. I can still see the exact grain of the wood, the coffee ring near the edge that never quite came out. She held my hands and she told me, "Your father is gone, honey, and I'm sorry to tell you this now, but he left behind nothing but debt. There's nothing for us. We'll have to figure this out together." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I was 17 years old and grieving, and she was my mother. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that within weeks of the funeral, my uncle and my aunt had quietly arranged to sell the house my father built with his own hands. The house I grew up in with the crooked porch step he never got around to fixing, and the oak tree in the backyard where he'd hung a tire swing when I was 6. Sold. Gone. Nobody asked me. Nobody so much as mentioned it was happening until it already had. The moment I turned 18, I packed 2 duffel bags, and I left. I didn't have a plan beyond leaving. A recruiter's office was 3 blocks from the apartment we'd moved into, and I walked in and signed papers before I let myself think too hard about it. The Army gave me something my family never had: structure, purpose, a reason to get up every morning that didn't depend on anyone else's permission or approval. Over the next 22 years, I built an entire life without them. I did 2 tours overseas. I earned my rank the hard way, inch by inch, year by year. I sent birthday cards to my mother for the first few years out of some stubborn sense of duty, and when the silence on the other end grew too heavy to keep carrying, I stopped. We spoke maybe once every couple of years, brief and stilted like strangers who happened to share a last name. My uncle I hadn't spoken to in over 15 years. That was the shape of my family: thin, distant, mostly silence. So there I was, 42 years old, sitting in a branch manager's office because I needed $500 for a transmission repair, and a woman named Diane Foster was pulling a thick manila folder out of a locked drawer like it was something fragile. "Ms. Bennetson," she said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me, "I need you to look at this." I scanned the numbers, certain there had been some clerical error, some mix-up with another Bennetson somewhere in the system. My eyes kept sliding back to one figure, sure I was misreading a decimal point. I hadn't misread anything. "There's a trust account under your name," Diane said, her voice gentle now, the way you'd talk to someone standing near a ledge. "It's held over $4.8 million. I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, because it was the only response my brain could produce. "That's not possible," I told her. "You have the wrong person. I don't have any trust. I don't have any family with that kind of money." Diane didn't laugh with me. She just looked at me with an expression of quiet, careful sympathy, the kind you give someone right before you tell them something that's going to break the floor out from under their feet. "We've verified it 3 times, Ms. Bennetson," she said. "There's no mistake." I sat very still. Somewhere outside the office, a phone was ringing, and nobody was answering it. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "Who set it up?" I asked, though some part of me, some old, buried 17-year-old part of me, already knew the answer before she said it. Diane turned the folder toward me and pointed to a name typed in plain black ink at the top of a legal document that was older than I wanted to believe. The name of the person who had established the trust was my father. For a long moment I couldn't make my mouth form any words at all. I just stared at his name on that page, Robert Bennetson, printed in the same clean serif font as every other legal document I'd ever seen, like it was nothing. Like it wasn't the name of a man who'd been dead for 25 years. "That's my father," I finally said, and even to my own ears my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "He died in 2001. He didn't have any money. We didn't have any money." Diane didn't argue with me. She just reached into that manila folder and started laying documents on the desk between us one at a time, like she was dealing cards in some game I didn't know the rules to. A certified copy of the trust agreement, dense with legal language. A death certificate, his death certificate, the one I remembered signing for at the hospital, though I hadn't seen the actual document in over 2 decades. The name and bar number of an attorney I'd never heard of. And a date stamped and notarized that stopped my breath in my chest. The trust had been established 3 months before my father died. 3 months. Which meant he hadn't been in some hospital bed drifting in and out of morphine, forgetting who he was. He'd been lucid enough, deliberate enough to sit down with a lawyer and structure something this precise, this carefully built, while he still had the strength to hold a pen steady. I made myself read the terms, though the words kept sliding around on the page like they didn't want to be understood. The language was formal, but the meaning underneath it was simple enough once I forced myself to slow down. All assets were to be held in trust, and were not to be distributed to me, not $1 of it, until I reached the age of 40. If I could not be located by that time, the trustee was directed to continue managing the account, indefinitely reinvesting the returns, waiting. Not liquidating, not reverting to any other beneficiary, just waiting for as long as it took for me. The original principal was just under $900,000, Diane said quietly, watching my face the way you'd watch someone doing complicated math in their head. Over 22 years of conservative but consistent investment that grew to what you see today. A little under $5 million, $900,000, in 2001. From a man who, according to my mother, had died owing more than he owned. I sat there with my hands flat on the desk, trying to steady something inside myself that had come completely loose from its moorings. Because here was the thing that was breaking me apart, more than the number on the page, more than the shock of it. My father hadn't left me nothing. He hadn't died and left me to scramble. Left me to be raised by a mother who told me there was no money, and an extended family who sold our house out from under me before the dirt on his grave had even settled. He had planned. He had thought of me specifically, deliberately in the last months of his life, and he had built something for me to come home to, which meant every single thing I had believed for 25 years was a lie somebody else had chosen to tell me. "Ms. Bennetson." Diane's voice pulled me back into the room. "Are you all right? Do you need water or—" "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't, not even close. I was doing that thing soldiers get trained to do, that flattening of the voice, the face, the whole visible self, so that whatever's happening underneath doesn't show on the surface. 22 years in the Army teaches you how to look calm while everything in you is on fire. "I just need a minute." She gave me more than a minute. She gave me the rest of the folder copies of everything and a business card for the attorney whose name kept appearing throughout the paperwork, a man named Harold Whitfield, with an address downtown and a phone number I would call within the hour. She explained gently that the bank's role had simply been custodial, that they'd been managing the account under the direction of the trustee for years, that they'd finally been able to locate and verify me through updated military service records that had crossed the trust administrator's desk. For what it's worth, she added as I was gathering the papers with hands that weren't entirely steady. "I've worked here 14 years. I've never seen a file like this one. Someone was determined that you get this. Whoever your father was, Ms. Bennetson, he didn't give up on you. I don't remember walking out of that bank. I don't remember getting into my car. What I remember is sitting in the driver's seat in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes, the folder on the passenger seat beside me like it was something that might combust if I looked at it wrong, my hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2 even though the engine wasn't running. 22 years. My father had built this and waited, or rather, someone had been made to wait on his behalf, holding a promise open for over 2 decades, while I was halfway across the world sleeping in barracks and convincing myself I didn't have a family worth thinking about. And somewhere in that same span of 22 years, my mother had looked me in the eye more than once at holidays we occasionally still shared at the rare phone call, and never once mentioned that my father had left anything behind at all. She had told me he left debt. She had told me there was nothing. I sat in that parking lot until the shaking in my hands settled into something colder, something with edges. Then I put the key in the ignition, and instead of driving toward the mechanic instead of driving home, I pointed the car toward the house where my mother still lived, 40 minutes away, and I didn't let myself think about what I was going to say once I got there. I just drove. My mother's house sat exactly where it had sat for the 15 years since she'd downsized after I left a modest ranch on a quiet street, with a lawn she still kept trimmed herself geraniums in clay pots along the porch rail. I'd been there maybe 6 times in 2 decades. I remembered where the spare key used to hide, though. I didn't need it. I didn't even remember the drive over, not really. Just the sensation of my hands on the wheel, the folder riding shotgun like a live thing, my mind running the same 4 words over and over, he didn't leave nothing. I knocked instead of ringing the bell. Some part of me wanted her to hear the difference. When she opened the door, the color went out of her face before I said a single word. Not confusion, not the polite surprise of an unexpected visit from a daughter who rarely visited. Recognition. She looked at the folder under my arm, and I watched something old and frightened move behind her eyes like she'd been waiting for this knock for 22 years. And some part of her was almost relieved it had finally come. "Kayla," she said. "What, is Uncle Frank here?" I asked, cutting her off because through the screen door I could already see him rising from the recliner in the living room, moving with the stiff urgency of a man caught somewhere he shouldn't be. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I stepped past her into the house I'd visited maybe a handful of times as an adult, and there he was, my mother's older brother, 71 years old now, silver-haired, and heavier than I remembered, standing by the fireplace like he'd been rehearsing an exit that wasn't going to happen. I set the folder down on the coffee table between us. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I just let it sit there thick and undeniable while the 3 of us stood in a living room that suddenly felt too small for what was about to happen in it. "I went to the bank today," I said, "for $500. You want to guess what I found instead?" For a moment nobody said anything. My mother's hand had gone to her throat, pressed flat against her collarbone the way it used to when I was a kid, and she was bracing for bad news on the phone. Uncle Frank's jaw worked, and I watched him try out the shape of a denial before he even spoke it. "Kayla, honey, I don't know what you think you—" "Don't," I said. My voice came out lower than I expected. Flatter the command voice I'd spent 20 years training into my own throat without ever meaning to use it on family. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me you don't know what this is." I opened the folder then and turned it so the first page faced them both. My father's name, the date, the terms. I watched Frank's eyes drop to the page and then away fast, like the paper itself had burned him. Nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed in the next room. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's sprinkler system kicked on that steady mechanical ticking, the only sound in the entire house, for what felt like a very long time. And then my mother sat down. Not gracefully, she sort of folded into the armchair by the window like her legs had simply stopped being willing to hold her up, and she put both hands over her face and she started to cry. Not the polite, controlled crying I remembered from my father's funeral when she'd stood so straight and dry-eyed that people commented on her strength. This was something else, something that had clearly been sitting under pressure for a very long time. "He knew," she said finally, her voice muffled behind her hands. "Your father knew months before that he wasn't going to make it. The doctors told him. He didn't tell either of us right away. He went to a lawyer instead. He told me afterward just once that he didn't want the money going to my side of the family. He said, she stopped, swallowed hard, made herself continue. He said he didn't trust them not to take it from you. I looked at Frank. Frank looked at the carpet. He was right, wasn't he? I said. It wasn't really a question. The rest came out slowly in pieces, the way confessions always seem to, when someone's been carrying them too long to just set them down all at once. After the funeral, Frank had somehow gotten wind that there was a trust through a slip from the attorney's office through gossip. It was never entirely clear, and he'd come to my mother with an argument dressed up as comfort. She'll never know, he told her. She's 17. Let it stay with family. We'll take care of her. We don't need to tell her about money she doesn't even know exists. And my mother, grieving, exhausted, 23 years younger than the woman sitting in that armchair now, had let herself be talked into it. Not once, over and over for years. Every time Whitfield's office managed to track down an address for me through the army, through public records, through whatever channels a determined attorney could find, Frank or my mother had intercepted it. Wrong forwarding address given. Letters marked, "Return to sender," by someone other than me. Phone messages that never made it past the machine. A trust officer told at least twice that Kayla had been informed, and simply wanted nothing to do with the money, wanted nothing to do with any of them. 22 years of lies engineered and maintained brick by brick, so that I would never find out what my father had actually done for me. How many times, I said, and my voice cracked on the second word in a way I hated, in a way I hadn't allowed since I was 17 years old, standing at a graveside in the rain. Did you tell someone I refused this? How many times did you speak for me when I never said a single word? Neither of them answered. And in the silence that followed, I understood that the answer didn't actually matter anymore, because whatever the number was, it had already cost me 22 years I was never getting back. I left my mother's house without another word. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already said itself in that silence, and I've learned over 20 years of command that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is keep talking, when the situation calls for you to step back and gather facts instead. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I went looking for the person who'd actually been fighting for me this whole time, even when I didn't know I needed fighting for. Harold Whitfield's office was on the 4th floor of an older building downtown, the kind with a brass elevator gate and hallways that smelled faintly of old paper and pipe tobacco that had probably soaked into the walls decades ago. His secretary, a woman close to his own age who introduced herself as Margaret, looked at me like she'd been expecting me for a very long time, which I would come to understand she had. Harold himself was well into his 70s, thin, silver-haired, with the kind of steady handshake that told you he'd shaken a lot of hands over a long career, and had never once let his grip get lazy. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He led me back to a room. I wasn't prepared for, a small, windowless file room, floor to ceiling with banker's boxes, every one of them labeled in careful block handwriting, Bennetson Trust, with a year written beneath each label, starting in 2001, and running all the way to the present. Every one of these, he said, gesturing at the boxes with something between exhaustion and quiet pride, represents an attempt to find you. Correspondence, attorney notes, certified mail receipts, court filings for updated service records. I stood in the doorway and tried to comprehend 22 years compressed into cardboard. He walked me through it box by box, year by year, and the picture that emerged was more thorough than I ever could have imagined. In the early years, he'd sent letters to the last known address my mother provided, letters that came back, he now understood, because she'd given him addresses that were slightly wrong. One digit off, just enough to guarantee a return to sender without looking deliberate. He'd made phone calls to numbers that were disconnected within weeks of my leaving for basic training, numbers nobody had bothered to update. He'd driven personally to the old address of the house I grew up in, only to find new owners who'd never heard of any Bennetson. When the paper trail went cold, he'd gotten more creative. He'd submitted formal requests through military channels trying to track service members by name, only to be told repeatedly that without a social security number or service record number, the Army couldn't and wouldn't release information on an active duty soldier to a private citizen trust attorney or not. He'd placed legal notices in newspapers in 3 different states, the kind small classified ads that nobody reads unless they're looking for exactly that kind of thing, hoping that somehow, somewhere it would reach me or someone who knew me. Every single time, I made progress. Harold said, settling into a chair across from me, folding his hands together in his lap. Your family intervened. I want to be very clear with you, Kayla. I couldn't disclose the existence of this trust publicly. My obligation was to your father's wishes and to the confidentiality terms he specified. I could search. I could not shout it from the rooftops. That limitation is what allowed them to keep running interference for as long as they did. So you just kept the money sitting there, I said. For 22 years. I kept it invested, and I kept looking, he corrected gently. Those were the only 2 things I was legally and morally permitted to do. Your father built the trust to survive exactly this kind of situation, deliberate obstruction. He didn't specify what would happen if you couldn't be found because he expected it to be difficult. He specified what would happen once you were. I sat with that for a moment, watching dust motes hang in the light from the room's one small window, feeling something in my chest that I couldn't yet name, not quite gratitude, not quite grief, something tangled up between the 2. Then Harold rose, walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the file room, and opened it with a key he kept on a chain in his vest pocket. He withdrew a single envelope, cream-colored, yellowed slightly at the edges, with 2 decades of careful storage. My name written across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen in 25 years, and recognized instantly anyway, the way you recognize a voice you thought you'd forgotten. Your father wrote this the same week he signed the trust documents. Harold said, placing it in my hands with a kind of reverence I hadn't expected from a man who dealt in legal paperwork for a living. He asked me to hold it unopened until the day the trust was finally distributed. I've carried it in that cabinet for 22 years, Kayla. I'll admit there were nights I wondered if I'd be handing it to someone else's grandchildren before I ever got to hand it to you. The envelope felt impossibly light for something that had waited so long to be opened. My name was the only word on the front. No address, no stamp, just Kayla in his handwriting in blue ink that had faded just slightly at the edges of each letter. My hands were not steady. I noticed that distantly, the way you notice things about your own body, when your mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere back in a hospital hallway, or in a kitchen with a coffee ring on the table, or in a version of my life where I'd never had to leave to survive my own family. Harold stepped back, giving me room, the quiet courtesy of a man who understood exactly what he was about to witness, and had no intention of intruding on it. I broke the seal. The paper inside had been folded in thirds, the creases gone soft and pale with age, and I unfolded it slowly, the way you'd handle something you were afraid might dissolve if you moved too fast. His handwriting filled the page, that same slanted, hurried script I remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards, except this time every letter looked deliberate, like a man who knew he was writing something he only got one chance to get right. Kayla, if you're reading this, it means the trust finally found its way to you. And that means I'm long gone. And that means more time has passed than I probably want to imagine right now while I'm writing this. I'm sitting at the kitchen table. Your kitchen table too, once I suppose, before everything that's coming, and I don't have a lot of time left to say what I need to say, so I'm going to try to say it plainly, the way I should have said more things to you while I still could. I had to stop there just for a moment because my throat had closed so tight I couldn't have read the next line out loud, even if there'd been anyone in that room to read it to. I know what's coming after I'm gone. I've watched your mother's family circle for months now, ever since word got around that I'm sick, and I know exactly what they're capable of when they think there's something to be had. I don't say that with hatred. Your mother is a good woman who loves you, but she's never been strong enough to stand up to her brother. And I think somewhere deep down I always knew that, and I forgave her for it a long time ago. Because loving someone means forgiving them for the ways they're not as brave as you need them to be. But I'm not willing to gamble your future on other people's weakness, so I built something they can't touch. Something that has to wait for you specifically, whether that takes 1 year or 40. I don't know how long it will take for this letter to reach you. I don't know what your life will look like by the time it does. I only know that I needed you to have this whenever you finally came looking, or whenever it finally came looking for you. I want you to know something else. Kayla, something I should have said more when you were 17, and I still had the chance to say it to your face instead of on a page. You were never the reason anything went wrong in this family. You were the only thing that ever went right. Watching you grow into someone stubborn and capable and unwilling to take anyone's word for anything without proof, that was the proudest thing I ever did in my life, and I didn't do much of it. You did that yourself. I don't know what you'll do with this money. I hope you'll take care of yourself first, because I have a feeling you won't, not unless someone tells you to. But more than that, I hope that by the time you're reading this, you've built a life so full and so solid that this trust feels less like something you needed and more like something you're finally allowed to have. Because if that's true, if you're reading this and you're already whole, then I did exactly what I set out to do. One day, if you read this letter, it will mean you've become strong enough not to need this money anymore, and that will be the proudest thing I never got to see. I love you. I never stopped, not for a single day, even the ones I wasn't there for. Dad. I don't remember making a sound, but Harold told me later gently that I had a single broken sound, that he said he'd only heard a handful of times in 40 years of practicing law, the sound of someone's entire understanding of their own life rearranging itself in real time. I sat in that small, windowless room surrounded by 22 years of boxes, and I cried the way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. Since the moment I'd stood at that graveside in the rain at 17 years old and made myself go numb, because numb was the only way I knew how to survive what was happening. Because here was the truth I'd been carrying wrong for 25 years. I had always believed my father left me nothing, that he'd checked out of my life the moment he died, and left me to be raised by people who saw me as a burden or worse, an obstacle. And the truth was the opposite of everything I'd believed. He hadn't left. He'd planned. In the last months of his life, weak and frightened and running out of time, he had thought only of protecting me from people he could already see circling, and he had built something strong enough to survive their interference for over 2 decades. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd fought for me from beyond the grave in the only language he had left: paperwork, patience, and a lawyer stubborn enough to keep every single box. When I finally looked up, Harold was still standing there, patient, his eyes wet too, and he said something that I've carried with me every day since. There's one more thing you should know, Kayla. In the process of investigating your family's interference over the years, the misdirected mail, the false statements to my office, the intercepted communications, my firm has documented what looks like a clear pattern of deliberate obstruction. Possibly worse. There's reason to believe assets belonging to the estate separate from the trust itself were also misappropriated along the way. I folded my father's letter carefully back along its worn creases and held it against my chest. I'm not interested in destroying them, I said, and I meant it even through the anger still burning somewhere underneath the grief. But I want the truth on the record, all of it. Harold nodded slowly. Then that, he said, is exactly what we're going to get. What followed wasn't quick, and it wasn't dramatic in the way courtroom scenes look on television. It was slow, methodical, the kind of process that happens mostly in conference rooms and depositions, and the quiet exchange of documents between attorneys. And I want to be honest about something before I tell you how it ended. I didn't go into this wanting to punish anyone. I know how that might sound, given everything you already know. But I'd spent 22 years being lied to, and what I wanted more than money, more than any kind of reckoning, was simply for the truth to exist. Somewhere official, somewhere permanent, where it couldn't be quietly reshaped by whoever told the story loudest. Harold's firm filed a formal accounting action, the legal mechanism that forces a trustee, or in this case forces the people who'd interfered with a trustee's duties, to lay out in detail everything that had happened over the life of the account. It also opened the door to examining what had happened to my father's estate outside the trust, the smaller assets that hadn't been protected the same way. That part turned out to be uglier than either of us expected. It came out piece by piece over the following months. My Uncle Frank had served unofficially, and without any court's knowledge, as something like a shadow executor of what remained of my father's estate after the house was sold, a role nobody had appointed him to, and nobody had the authority to give him. Small accounts, A modest life insurance payout that should have named me as beneficiary, but had somehow been redirected years earlier through paperwork. My mother, grieving and unmoored, had signed without fully understanding what she was signing. None of it was trust money that had been locked away untouchable, exactly as my father designed. But it was money that should have been mine regardless, and it hadn't been. I sat through 2 depositions. I watched my uncle under oath try out several different versions of the truth before settling reluctantly on something closer to what had actually happened. I watched my mother in a separate room weep through most of hers, taking responsibility in a way that felt for the first time in over 2 decades genuine rather than performed for my benefit. The court's findings, when they finally came, were measured rather than punishing. There was no fraud conviction, no headline-grabbing verdict, nothing that would have satisfied anyone looking for a dramatic ending. What there was instead was a clear legal determination. My uncle, my mother, and 2 other relatives who'd benefited peripherally over the years had breached their duties of disclosure and had, in several documented instances, acted to obstruct the lawful administration of my father's trust. The court ordered restitution repayment of misappropriated funds, with interest calculated back to the dates of the original transactions, along with the legal costs Harold's firm had incurred pursuing the matter on my behalf. Nobody went to prison. I want to be clear about that because I know some of you listening might want a harder ending than the one I actually got, and I understand that instinct. But that was never what this was about for me. What actually happened in the end was something I hadn't fully anticipated, and honestly found more satisfying than any prison sentence could have been. The truth became public record. Not splashed across headlines, this wasn't that kind of case, but documented, findable, permanent. Extended family members who had spent 2 decades telling a version of my story that painted me as the daughter who ran off and never looked back. The ungrateful one. The one who apparently wanted nothing to do with whatever her father might have left behind those people, now had to reckon with a court record that told a very different story. Word travels in families, even families as fractured as mine. My mother told me months later in a phone call that was shorter and more careful than the ones we'd once shared, but real in a way our conversations hadn't been in years, that 2 of her own sisters had stopped speaking to Frank entirely once the full accounting came out. That an aunt who'd once told extended family at a wedding that Kayla clearly didn't care enough to claim what little her father left her had been quietly, uncomfortably confronted by her own children about that comment. I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't need them, not really, not in any way that would have changed what those years had cost me. But they came anyway, a few of them stiff and overdue, and offered mostly out of self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, I suspect. I accepted them the way you accept a gift you don't especially want, but understand the giver needed to offer politely without much warmth, and without letting it change anything about how I'd chosen to move forward. What mattered more than any of that was something quieter. Something that happened in the space between depositions and court filings in the evenings, after long days of lawyers and paperwork, when I'd go home to my small rental and sit with my father's letter open on the kitchen table, reading it again and again until I'd nearly memorized every line. He had told me that if I ever read that letter, it would mean I'd become strong enough not to need the money anymore. And sitting there night after night, I started to understand that he'd been right about more than he probably knew. I had built a life, a hard one, an imperfect one, but mine entirely. Mine built with no help from any of the people who were now being ordered by a court to account for what they'd taken. The money wasn't going to complete me. It was never going to fill in whatever gaps 22 years of absence had carved out. But it was going to let me build something with what he'd left me. And I already knew before the case even closed exactly what that was going to look like. People sometimes ask me what it felt like to suddenly have that much money after a lifetime of counting exact change at the grocery store, and the honest answer is that it felt almost nothing like what you'd expect. I didn't buy a bigger house right away. I didn't buy a new car, even though the Civic's transmission finally did give out completely about 6 weeks after everything settled, and I replaced it with something reliable and practical and about as far from extravagant as you can get. 22 years of enlisted and officer pay teaches you habits that don't just disappear because a number changed on an account statement. The first thing I did once the legal proceedings closed and the funds were fully released to me was pay off every debt I had, the modest remainder on my car loan, a small balance on a credit card I'd been chipping away at for years, the last stretch of a personal loan I'd taken out during a rough deployment year to help cover an emergency dental surgery my insurance hadn't fully covered. It felt strange, almost anticlimactic, to watch those balances zero out in a single afternoon after years of budgeting around them. I sat at my kitchen table afterward and just breathed for a while the way you breathe, after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it had weight. Then I bought a house. Small 3 bedrooms, nothing showy, a place with a decent yard and good bones close enough to base that I could still get to work without a long commute, far enough from my mother's side of the family that running into any of them by accident wasn't a realistic concern. I remember standing in the empty living room on closing day sunlight coming through windows that were finally entirely mine and thinking about the house I grew up in, the one with the crooked porch step and the tire swing sold out from under me before I was old enough to have any say in it. This house couldn't be sold out from under me. Nobody could walk into a kitchen and tell me a story about what I did or didn't deserve. That mattered more to me than the square footage ever could. But the house, the debt, the new car, those were just the practical pieces. What I actually wanted to do with my father's gift went further than fixing my own life. I set up a scholarship fund first, working with Harold's firm to structure it properly for children of service members who'd been killed in the line of duty. I know what it's like to lose a parent young, and suddenly to have your whole understanding of the future rearranged in a single terrible afternoon, and I know how much a door held open, college tuition, a trade school program, whatever path a kid needs, can matter to someone standing at the edge of that kind of loss, with no idea how they're supposed to move forward. We funded the first 3 scholarships within a year. I've since watched from a respectful distance as one of those kids graduated nursing school, and I won't pretend that didn't undo me a little in the best possible way. I gave a substantial donation to my local public library, the same kind of library I used to spend hours in as a teenager after my father died, back when home felt too complicated to sit in, and the library was the only place that felt neutral, quiet mine. They used part of it to renovate their children's wing, and part of it to fund a veterans resource program helping former service members navigate benefits paperwork that can be so dense and demoralizing, it stops people from claiming things they've earned. And I started volunteering more hours than I probably should have given with a local veterans support organization, helping with housing assistance for vets coming off active duty with nowhere stable to land. I understood something about instability that most volunteers there didn't. I understood what it felt like to build your whole sense of self around not needing anyone, because the people who were supposed to be there for you weren't. I wanted to be, in whatever small way I could, the kind of steady presence I hadn't had growing up. I still wear my uniform to work every single day. That surprises people sometimes, given everything like they expect $5 million to have changed something fundamental about who I am or what I do with my time. But my father's letter said something that stuck with me harder than almost anything else in it, that he hoped the money would find me already whole, already living a life so full it felt less like a need and more like a gift I was finally allowed to accept. I think about that most mornings when I put my uniform on. The money didn't make my life. I'd already made my life the hard way, one deployment and one promotion and one lonely holiday at a time. The money just made sure nobody could ever again tell me a story about what I supposedly didn't deserve. On my days off, I drive out to the cemetery where my father's buried, a modest plot under an old maple tree that's grown considerably since I stood there at 17 in the rain. I don't visit often enough. I don't think anyone ever visits often enough, no matter how much they mean to. But when I do, I bring a folding chair and I sit with him for a while, and I always bring the letter even though I know every word of it by heart now. Last time I went, I sat with the letter in my lap, and I told him out loud, the way you're not supposed to talk to a headstone, but everyone eventually does anyway, that the transmission finally got fixed, that the house has good bones, that there are 3 kids in college who never met him but carry a small piece of what he built for me forward into their own lives now. I told him I finally understood what he'd been trying to give me, and it was never really about the number in that account at all.